He found her standing in the snow before dawn, hands steady over a dying child. So why did the whole valley still whisper her name like a warning? The door slams open, cold air rushing in, and Clara doesn't look up. Steam curls from the basin at her knees. The girl's breath stutters under the blankets. "Stay with me," Clara murmurs, wringing another cloth. Outside, boots crunch fast on frozen ground, Luke's voice calling her name for the first time, and she still doesn't turn. Follow for more stories like this. By the time the sun reached over the low ridge east of Dust Hollow Valley, Clara Hayes had already finished her morning chores. The goats were fed. The small tin pail hung back on its nail beside the door. A line of damp cloths moved slow in the wind, carrying the faint scent of sage and soap. Inside the narrow house, a kettle sat cooling on the stove. Its lid tilted just enough to let the steam slip out in quiet threads. Clara stepped out with 2 baskets balanced in her hands, eggs wrapped in cloth, a few jars of honey tucked between them so they wouldn't knock together on the road. She closed the door behind her without looking back, same as always. The road into Grayson Ridge ran thin and dusty between low brush and scattered rock. Wagon tracks hardened in the earth from weeks without rain. When she passed the old Miller fence, one board still leaned crooked where it had been for years. No one had fixed it. No one had asked her to. By the time she reached town, the morning had started to gather. A man swept the porch outside the mercantile. 2 women stood near the water pump, talking low, their voices dipping just enough when Clara walked by. "She keeps to herself," one said. "Too much so," the other answered. Clara didn't turn. She shifted the baskets in her hands and kept walking. The boards beneath her boots gave a soft, familiar creak as she crossed the narrow stretch near the schoolhouse hill. That was when she heard it. A sharp crack, wood under strain. Then the sudden, wild scream of a horse. Clara stopped. Another sound followed, short, high, cut off too quickly. A child. She didn't run at first, just set the baskets down in the middle of the road, careful so nothing inside would tip. Then she moved. Up the incline, past the bend, where the ground dipped uneven. The wagon had already gone half off the road. One wheel spun useless in the air. The harness pulled tight as the horse stamped and fought against it, eyes wide, foam gathering at the bit. Beneath the tilt of the wagon, a boy lay pinned at the shoulder under a slide of cut timber, not crushed, just stuck, and scared enough that his breath came in sharp, broken bursts. Clara stepped in close. "Easy now," she said, low and steady. Not to the horse, not to the boy, but somewhere between them. She moved around the side, placed one hand against the heaviest beam, tested its weight. Her boots dug into the dirt. For a second, nothing shifted. Then she leaned in. Her shoulder pressed hard into the wood. Muscles tightened through her back and arms. The beam lifted just enough. "That's it," she said, breath even. "Slide out." The boy didn't move. "Look at me," Clara said. He did. "Now." He pulled, one arm free, then the other. Clara held the weight until he cleared it completely, then let the timber drop back into place with a dull thud. The horse quieted, as if the worst of it had passed. Clara crouched beside the boy, brushed dust and splinters from his coat, checked his arms, his ribs with quick, practiced hands. "You hurt?" He shook his head, but his lip trembled. She nodded once. "Breathe with me." She drew in a slow breath, let it out. He followed. Once. Twice. The tightness in his face eased just a little. "There now," she said. "You're all right." Footsteps came pounding down the hill behind her. "Eli!" Clara stood before the man reached them. Luke Mercer dropped to his knees beside the boy, pulling him close, one hand pressed firm at the back of his head as if to keep him there. "You hurt?" Luke asked, voice rough. "I'm okay," Eli said, though his eyes still held the last of the fear. Luke looked up then. For a second, he didn't speak. Clara stood a few steps back, dust on her dress, hands empty now. Her face gave nothing away. Not pride, not worry. Just stillness. "She's fine," she said. Frightened, not broken. The axle took the worst of it. Luke blinked once like he'd missed something. "Thank you," he started. But Clara had already turned. She walked back down the slope, past the bend, to where her baskets waited in the road. One had tipped slightly. A thin line of yolk seeped through the cloth from a cracked egg. She adjusted it without hurry, lifted both baskets again, and continued towards a town. Luke watched her go. He knew the outline of her, the way a man knows something he's seen at a distance too many times to count. A figure at the edge of things, a name half spoken, half dismissed in passing. But standing there now, with his son steady on his feet, and the echo of her voice still in the air, the stories didn't fit. Eli tugged at his sleeve. "Who was that?" Luke didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, where she had disappeared, the dust settling back into place like nothing had happened. "I don't know," he said at last. But the words sat wrong in his mouth, because for the first time he meant to find out. And for the rest of that morning, as the town went on with its quiet talk and careful glances, Luke Mercer found himself thinking of the woman who had not waited to be thanked, and wondering why everyone else had. He tied his horse outside the mercantile just past noon. The hitching post creaked when the wind shifted, carrying dust along the boards. Inside, the place smelled of coffee beans and dry goods, the faint sweetness of molasses in the air. Martha Keene stood behind the counter, weighing out flour into a paper sack. She looked up when Luke came in, gave a nod, then went back to her scale. "That your boy this morning?" she asked after a moment. Luke set a coin down. "It was. He's lucky." Luke didn't answer right away. He rested one hand on the counter, thumb tracing a groove worn smooth over years. "The woman," he said finally. "Name's Clara Hayes?" Martha's hands paused, just for a second. Then she folded the paper sack closed, neat and practiced. "That's what they call her." Luke watched her. "That what you call her?" Martha shrugged, not looking up. "She keeps to herself." "That all?" "That's enough for most folks." He picked up the sack, but didn't move to leave. "People talk." "They always do." Luke waited. The floorboard near the stove creaked as someone shifted in the back room. Outside, a wagon rolled past slow iron rims grinding against dirt. Martha finally met his eyes. "She had her chance," she said. "Years back." Luke tilted his head slightly. "That so?" "That's so." He gave a short nod, like he'd heard it, but not taken it in. Then he stepped out into the light again. The sun had climbed higher. The road shimmered a little in the heat. He stood there longer than he meant to, the sack of flour hanging loose at his side. She had her chance. The words didn't sit right. That afternoon, Eli followed him out to the barn, still talking about the woman on the hill. "She told me to breathe," the boy said, swinging his legs from the fence rail. "Like this." He demonstrated, slow and careful, chest rising and falling. Luke leaned against the post, watching him. "She did, huh?" "And it worked." Luke nodded once. "Looks like it did." Eli kicked at the dirt with the heel of his boot. "She didn't stay." "No," Luke said. "She didn't." That evening, after the chores were done and the sky had turned the color of worn copper, Luke saddled up again. He didn't tell Eli where he was going. The boy watched anyway, quiet, knowing enough not to ask. The road to red clay ran narrow past the last stretch of town, then opened into a wide, empty sweep of land. Wind moved low across it, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant water. At the far end, a small house sat alone, wood worn gray by sun and years. A short fence leaned uneven around a patch of garden that still held its lines. Luke slowed his horse near the gate. Clara Hayes was there, kneeling in the dirt, hands deep in the soil as if she was listening to it. She looked up once, not surprised, not welcoming, just aware. "The eggs were the least of it," she said, brushing her hands clean against her skirt. "Come in if you're coming." Luke stepped down from the saddle, looped the reins loose over the post. The gate gave a low creak when he pushed it open. Up close, the place was smaller than it looked from the road. Orderly, every tool set where it belonged. A bucket by the well, rope coiled just right. He stopped a few steps from her. "Boy's fine," he said. She nodded once. "I figured." He shifted his weight, not quite sure what came next. "Brought some oats," he said, lifting the small sack from his saddle. She glanced at it, then at him. "Goats'll take that." He held it out. She took it without ceremony, set it by the door. Inside, the house was warm from the day's heat. A kettle sat on the stove. 2 cups beside it, though only one had been used. Eli arrived the next week before Luke had even reached the gate. He ran ahead, boots kicking up dust, pushing the gate open like he'd done it all his life. "She got honey," he called back, already halfway to the porch. Luke followed slower. Clara stood in the doorway, a jar in her hand. She handed it to Eli without a word. He took it like it was something expected. "You mind?" Luke asked, nodding toward the boy. Clara shook her head. "He doesn't break things." Eli smiled at that. The visit settled into something neither of them named. Luke would bring what he had: salt, a strip of dried meat, once a small sack of coffee beans wrapped in cloth. Clara would send him back with jars, bundles of herbs tied with string, something for Eli's cough that came and went with the wind. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. One afternoon, the wind picked up sharp, catching the edge of Clara's headscarf and pulling it loose. It slipped from her shoulder before she could catch it. Luke stepped forward without thinking, reached out, then stopped. His hand hovered there, just short of touching her. Clara caught the cloth herself, tied it back in place with steady fingers. Neither of them said anything. Luke dropped his hand, looked off toward the fence line like he'd meant to do that all along. Eli didn't notice. He was sitting on the porch, dipping his finger into the honey jar when he thought no one was looking. That night, riding back under a sky full of stars, Luke found himself turning over the same question again. Not what people said about her, but what they didn't, and why a woman who spoke so little could leave a room feeling quieter than before she entered it. He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing. He wasn't done asking. The nights grew longer as autumn settled in. Wind came down off the ridge sharper now, slipping through cracks in the barn boards and under the door like it had a mind of its own. Luke noticed it more than usual. Not the cold, the quiet. Eli slept easier these days. No coughing fits in the night. No restless turning. The bundle of dried leaves Clara had tied with twine hung near the stove, giving off a faint, bitter scent when the heat rose. Luke had meant to ask her what it was made of. He never did. Instead, he rode out again the following Saturday, same as before. A sack of coffee this time, folded tight in brown paper, the receipt still tucked inside where Martha had slid it. Clara was not in the garden. The door stood half open, just enough to let the light fall across the wooden floor inside. Luke paused at the threshold, knocked once against the frame. No answer. He stepped in, slow. The room held its usual order, nothing out of place. A cup near the stove, a small knife laid beside it, blade clean. The kettle sat just off the heat, like it had been moved there not long ago. A sound came from the back, not loud, just the scrape of wood against wood. Clara stood near the rear table, her back to him, sleeves rolled up, a basin of water in front of her, tinged faintly with brown. She didn't turn right away. "You're early," she said. Luke shifted the paper bundle in his hands. Store was quiet. She nodded once, kept working. He set the coffee down near the stove. The paper made a soft crinkling sound as it settled. "What happened?" he asked after a moment. Clara reached into the basin, lifted a cloth, wrung it out slow. The water darkened further as it twisted free. "Goat caught itself on a wire," she said. "Nothing worth worrying over." Luke glanced toward the open back door, saw the animal tied near the post, standing still, one hind leg lifted slightly. "You need a hand?" "No." The word came easy, not sharp, just final. Luke nodded, leaned his shoulder against the doorframe instead, stayed where he was. For a while, neither of them spoke. Water dripped from the cloth back into the basin. The wind shifted outside, brushing dry leaves against the wall. Somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter knocked once, then again. Clara set the cloth aside, dried her hands on a folded rag. Only then did she turn. Her eyes met his for a brief second, then moved past him to the open door. "You can close that," she said. Luke pushed it shut with his foot. The room dimmed a little. "You been asking about me," she said, not looking at him. Luke didn't answer right away. "People talk," she added. "They do," he said. She gave a small nod, like that settled it. "They told you I had my chance." Luke let out a slow breath. "Something like that." Clara picked up the empty basin, carried it to the side, poured the water out through a narrow gap in the boards. It ran dark into the dirt below. "They always tell it the same way," she said. "Simple, clean, easy to repeat." She set the basin back down, turned again, slower this time. "There was a man," she said. Luke stayed quiet. "Douglas Rains," she went on. "Had more land than he knew what to do with. People said I was lucky when he came calling." Her mouth shifted slightly, not quite a smile. He liked things done his way. The wind pressed once against the wall, then moved on. "He told me what my life would look like," she said, "before I'd agreed to it." Luke's hand tightened slightly where it rested against the frame. "What kind of life?" Clara reached for the kettle, poured what little water remained into the cup on the table. "One where I didn't have time for anything that wasn't his." She set the cup down untouched. "My mother was already sick by then. Couldn't stand on her own some days." Luke's gaze dropped to the floor, then back up. "He said that would change," Clara continued. "After the wedding." "How?" She looked at him then, direct. "He said I'd forget about her, so." The words hung there. No rise, no fall. Just placed where they couldn't be moved. Luke swallowed once. "And you didn't," he said. Clara shook her head. "No." "What happened after?" She picked up the cloth again, folded it slow, precise, like it mattered how it was done. "I stayed," she said. 3 years. Till the end." Luke nodded, barely. "And him?" Clara let out a breath through her nose. Not quite a laugh. "He didn't like being told no." The wind found the edge of the roof, lifted it just enough to make a low, hollow sound. "He told his story," she said. and it was easier for folks to believe than mine. Luke pushed himself off the frame, took one step into the room. "And yours?" he asked. Clara looked down at the folded cloth in her hands. "Didn't seem to matter," she said. Silence settled in again, thicker this time. After a while, Luke reached for the coffee he'd brought, opened the paper. The smell filled the room, warm and bitter. Clara glanced at it once. "Eli'll like that," she said. Luke nodded. "He already does." He poured a little into the cup, added hot water from the kettle after setting it back on the stove. He didn't offer it, just set it within her reach. Clara didn't take it, not right away. But she didn't move it aside either. That night, riding back under a sky gone thin and pale with early stars, Luke heard Eli's voice before he saw the house. "Did she say anything?" the boy asked, meeting him halfway across the yard. Luke swung down slow. "She did," he said. Eli waited. Luke rested a hand on the fence post, looking out past the barn toward the dark line of hills. "Why do they say she's wrong?" Eli asked. Luke took a long breath. The words came and went in his mind. None of them fit. He shook his head. "I don't know," he said. But for the first time, he knew something else. They'd been wrong all along. Winter didn't arrive all at once in Dust Hollow. It came in pieces. A thin frost one morning that didn't melt until noon. A wind that stayed longer than it should. Then one night, the cold settled in and didn't leave. By the second week, folks in Grayson Ridge had started talking about the fever. Not loud, not yet. Just quiet mentions at the mercantile. A name here, a cough there. Someone staying home who usually didn't. Luke heard it while loading feed. "Dalton's girl took sick," one man said, tying off a sack. "Burning up, they say." Luke didn't stop working, but his hands slowed. "Doctor coming?" someone asked. Snow caught him up past Miller's Ridge. Might be 2 days yet. Luke tightened the rope on the wagon bed. The fibers creaked under his pull. That night, Eli slept heavy. No coughing, no stirring. The small bundle of herbs Clara had given still hung near the stove, faint and steady. Luke stood there longer than he needed to, listening. Morning came gray. Wind pushed low across the valley, carrying a fine dust of snow that never quite settled. Luke saddled up early, more out of habit than need. He hadn't planned to ride to Red Clay, but he did. Clara's house stood as it always had, quiet. Smoke lifting thin from the chimney. He dismounted, tied the reins, knocked once. No answer. The door wasn't locked. It rarely was. He stepped inside. The room felt different. Not empty. Just paused. The kettle sat off the fire. Cold. The chair near the table pushed back slightly, like someone had stood up in a hurry. Luke's gaze moved across the room, then to the back door. It stood open. Wind slipped through, carrying snowflakes that melted as they touched the floor. He stepped out. Tracks led away from the house. Fresh, straight, not toward town, toward the Dalton place. Luke stood there a moment, the cold settling into his coat. Then he turned, mounted up, and followed. The road narrowed as it dipped into the low bend before the Dalton house. Snow gathered deeper there, packed uneven by wagon wheels and boot prints. By the time he reached the yard, the place was quiet. Too quiet. No lantern on the porch. No movement at the window. Luke tied off his horse and stepped up. The door opened before he knocked. Mrs. Dalton, her face drawn, eyes hollow from lack of sleep, stood there, one hand still on the latch. She didn't speak, just stepped aside. Inside, the room was dim. Curtains pulled tight. The air thick with heat and something sharper underneath. Clara knelt beside the bed. Her sleeves were rolled, hair tied back. A basin of water sat near her knee, steam barely rising from it. Cloths lined the edge, damp and ready. A small girl lay beneath the blankets, skin flushed, breathing shallow, uneven. Clara didn't look up. "Close the door," she said. Luke did. The latch clicked soft behind him. "More water," Clara added, her voice steady, low. "Not too hot." Mrs. Dalton moved at once, hands shaking but obedient. Luke stood near the wall, not in the way, not out of the room, just there. Clara lifted a cloth, wrung it slow, pressed it to the girl's forehead, waited, counted something only she seemed to hear. "Breathe," she murmured. "Easy now." The girl's chest rose, fell, faltered. Mrs. Dalton turned back with the kettle, nearly spilling it. "Set it there," Clara said without looking. "Careful." Hours passed. The wind outside grew louder, then softer, then gone. No one marked the time. Luke stepped forward once, reached for the basin when Clara shifted it aside, refilled it without being asked. Set it back. Their hands brushed for the briefest moment. Neither of them said anything. Near dawn, the girl's breathing changed. Slower, deeper. The tight pull in her chest eased. Clara watched, waited, one hand still resting light against the blanket. "Stay with it," she said quietly. Mrs. Dalton nodded, though her eyes had already filled. Minutes stretched. Then, at last, the girl slept. Not the restless turning of fever. Real sleep. Mrs. Dalton sat down hard in the chair beside the bed. Her shoulders shook once, then again. The sound she made stayed low, like she was afraid to wake the child. Clara stood, slowly, like her body remembered the work all at once. She moved to the stove, set water to heat, found a cup, measured leaves from a small pouch. No hurry, no words about the night, about the years, about anything that had been said before. She placed the cup in Mrs. Dalton's hands. "Drink," she said. The woman did. Luke watched from where he stood. Clara wiped her hands, reached for her coat. Mrs. Dalton looked up, eyes red. "Why?" she asked, voice breaking around the word. Clara paused at the door, considered it, then shook her head once. "Child was sick," she said. "That's reason enough." She stepped outside. The first light of morning had begun to touch the ridge. Snow lay thin across the ground, just enough to soften the edges of everything. Luke followed a moment later. Clara was already halfway to the gate. He caught up near the fence. "You walked here," he said. She nodded. "You could have sent word." She glanced at him, then back toward the road. "No need," she said. They stood there for a second. The cold between them. The quiet after a long night. Luke shifted his hat in his hands, opened his mouth, then closed it again. Clara moved first, back through the gate, onto the road. Luke watched her go, same as he had that morning on the hill. Only this time, something had changed. Not in her, in everything around her. And for the first time, he wondered how long it would take the rest of the valley to see what had been standing in front of them all along. It didn't happen all at once. Grayson Ridge didn't change with a single word or apology. It shifted the way dust shifts under a steady wind, quiet, almost unseen, until one day the ground looks different. Luke noticed it first at the mercantile. Martha Keene didn't lower her voice when Clara's name came up. She said it plain, like it belonged in the room. Reverend Cole tipped his hat when Clara passed the church steps, not out of habit, but with a pause that meant something. Mrs. Dalton, who had once turned her back in the street, stood still now, long enough to meet Clara's eyes, long enough to nod. Clara didn't answer the nod, but she didn't turn away either. Winter eased. The snow thinned along the fence lines. Water found its way back into the shallow creek, running slow and brown at first, then clearer with each passing day. Luke kept riding out to Red Clay, sometimes with Eli, sometimes alone. He never named what those visits were, didn't call them anything at all. One evening, the light stretched long across the valley, turning the grass pale gold where it showed through the last patches of snow. Eli had fallen asleep inside, curled on the bench near the stove, one hand still resting against the edge of Clara's table. Luke stood on the porch, hat in his hands. Clara sat on the step below him, elbows resting on her knees, looking out over the land like she always did. For a while, neither of them spoke. The wind moved soft that evening. Not sharp, not cold, just enough to carry the smell of thawing earth and wood smoke. "They've got a name for you," Luke said at last. Clara didn't turn. "I've heard it," she said. Luke nodded once, though she couldn't see it. "I have too," he said. Silence again. A horse shifted in the distance, the faint clink of a loose chain somewhere down the road. Luke rolled the brim of his hat between his fingers, stopped, started again. "I've been thinking on it," he said, trying to come up with something better. Clara's hands tightened slightly where they rested, just for a moment, then still again. "That's so," she said. Luke let out a breath, slow. "Couldn't find the right word," he said. "Not one that fit." Clara turned her head just enough to look at him then. Not fully, just enough. Luke met her eyes. For once, he didn't look away. "To me," he said, voice lower now, steadier than he felt. "You're beautiful." The words settled between them, not sharp, not sudden, just there. Clara didn't move, didn't speak. The wind shifted again, brushing a loose strand of hair against her cheek. She didn't lift her hand to fix it. Luke stood where he was, not stepping closer, not pulling back. Time stretched. From inside, Eli turned in his sleep, the bench creaking softly beneath him. Clara's gaze dropped, not to the ground, but to the space between them. Like she was measuring something she hadn't been asked to measure in a long time. "You plan to keep saying that?" she asked finally. Luke didn't hesitate. "Yes." Her fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her skirt. "Until you believe it," she said. Luke gave a small nod. "As long as it takes." Clara looked back out over the valley. The light had shifted again, the gold fading into something softer, quieter. She let out a breath she hadn't seemed to know she was holding, and for the first time since he'd known her, something in her posture changed. Not much, just enough. A small easing. Spring came slow after that. Grass returned in patches. The goats grew restless in their pen. Eli started running ahead again on the road, kicking at stones, talking about things that didn't matter and everything at once. The day they married, the church in Grayson Ridge filled without being asked. No announcement had gone out. Still, they came. Martha stood near the front. Reverend Cole cleared his throat more than once before he began. Mrs. Dalton sat in the second row, hands folded tight, eyes not leaving Clara for a single second. Clara wore a simple dress. Clean. Pressed. Nothing more. Luke stood beside her, hat held low in both hands. Eli stayed close. Closer than usual. One hand caught in Clara's, holding on without looking like he needed to. When the preacher spoke the words, Luke leaned just enough to be heard by her alone. "There," he said soft. "That's your right name now." Clara didn't answer, but her hand didn't pull away. By summer, the road to Red Clay saw more tracks than it had in years. People came with small things, a broken hinge, a sick animal, a question they didn't know how to ask anywhere else. Children came running, not careful, not quiet, just straight to the door. And when they called out, they didn't use the old name. They called for Clara. Sometimes, when the sun dropped low and the valley settled into that quiet it always returned to, Luke would find her on the porch, looking out over the same stretch of land. He'd sit beside her, not saying much. Didn't need to. The wind would move through the grass. The boards beneath them would creak in the same places they always had. And somewhere in that quiet, without anyone needing to point it out, the name that had once followed her everywhere simply stopped. Not because it had been argued away, not because it had been corrected, but because, at last, it no longer fit. And the one that did had been there all along. If you had stood where Clara stood, year after year, hearing the same quiet judgments, feeling doors close before you ever reached them, you might have learned to live without expecting anything different. You might have kept your head down, done your work, told yourself it was enough, and maybe it was, until someone looked at you and didn't see what the world had decided. Not your past, not the stories told about you, just you. There's something powerful about that kind of seeing. It doesn't come loud. It doesn't force its way in. It waits. It listens. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't try to change who you are. It reminds you of who you've been all along. Clara didn't become someone new. The world around her simply caught up. And maybe that's the part that stays with you. Not the wedding, not the quiet way the valley changed, but the thought that somewhere, at some point, the right person might look at you and call you by a name that feels like home. If you've ever felt unseen or misunderstood, I'd like to hear where you're watching from and what part of this story stayed with you. There are more stories like this waiting just ahead, stories about people who held on even when no one was looking, and what found them when they did.